You know the feeling, right? You pull out your phone, you tap an app, and just like that, a car is on its way. It feels like magic. It's Uber. But behind that incredibly simple screen is a massive, sprawling trail of data. Your data. And while the story of what happened to that data is a whole lot more complicated, and honestly, way more shocking than you'd think. All right, let's get into it. Just stop and think about that for a second. Every single trip you've ever taken, every home address, every office, every friend's place you've ever put in, not to mention your name, your phone number, your email, it all gets stored on a server somewhere. So the real question we're digging into here is, how safe has any of that information actually been? I want to start with just one number because it really sets the stage for everything else. 57 million. That's how many people, we're talking both riders and drivers, had their personal info snatched in just one of Uber's data breaches. But here's the truly wild part. For more than a year, not a single one of those 57 million people had any idea it even happened. To really get how this all went down, you have to understand just how fast Uber grew. I mean, it launched in 2009 and completely turned transportation on its head. But to make that magic happen, it had to collect a mind-boggling amount of our data. Where we are, where we're going, who we are. And in doing that, it created this giant, glittering treasure trove for hackers and a massive, massive responsibility for the company. Now, these huge data breaches, they didn't just pop up out of thin air. No, there were warning signs. Big, flashing red flags in the company's culture that pointed to this really casual, sometimes even reckless attitude toward our privacy. And it all kind of started with an internal tool that had let's just say, a very telling name. They called it GodView. Just let that name sink in for a moment. This was a system that literally gave Uber employees the power to see, in real time, the little dot of any car and any customer on their map. And as we all know, with great power comes some really, really questionable behavior. And it got questionable fast. Back in 2011, reports came out that GodView was being used as a literal party trick to show off where specific users were. A few years later, a journalist found out an executive had been tracking her without her permission. There were even allegations that employees used it to snoop on politicians and celebrities. You see, this wasn't some kind of technical glitch. This was a feature of a corporate culture that treated our data like it was their personal plaything. Then came the first real security test. In 2014, a hacker found a super-sensitive access key to Uber's Amazon cloud servers just sitting out in the open on a public GitHub page. They used it to get the personal info of around 50,000 drivers. But here's the critical part. Uber found out about this in September and then said nothing for more than 5 months. That long silence, it set a really dangerous precedent. And that brings us to the main event, because the 2016 breach wasn't just another technical screw-up. Oh no. This was an active, deliberate cover-up, a conspiracy, really, designed to hide a massive data theft from millions of people. This is where the story pivots from just being careless to being criminal. The sheer scale of this is just staggering. We're talking about the data of 57 million riders, names, emails, phone numbers, all stolen. And for about 600,000 of their drivers, it was even worse. Hackers got their driver's license numbers. This was a 5-alarm fire, a total security catastrophe. And Uber's response was to quietly find a fire extinguisher and pretend it never happened. Okay, so let's walk through exactly how they pulled this off. First, and you're not going to believe this, the hackers got in the exact same way they did in 2014. They found login credentials just lying around on GitHub. So they contacted Uber's chief security officer, a guy named Joe Sullivan. Now, instead of sounding the alarm, Sullivan's team paid the hackers $100,000. But they cleverly disguised it as a bug bounty, like a reward for finding a security flaw. And then they made the hackers sign NDAs, legally binding them to silence. And just like that, for more than a year, the company, the government, and all 57 million victims were kept completely in the dark. And this quote right here just says it all. According to prosecutors, after the cover-up was arranged, Joe Sullivan told his team that the official story was simple. This investigation does not exist. I mean, that's not just sweeping something under the rug. That's a direct order to conceal what was happening. But you know, secrets this big have a way of coming out. And when new leadership eventually took over at Uber, the truth finally surfaced. And the fallout from that revelation was immediate, it was severe, and frankly, it was historic. The change in strategy was like night and day. You had the old guard, under then CEO Travis Kalanick, whose playbook was to pay hush money and hide the problem. Then the new CEO, Darakash Shahi, gets wind of this in 2017. He does the complete opposite. He fires Salhan and his top deputy, and then he goes public with the whole ugly story. It was a crystal clear signal. The cover-ups are over. And then the bills started coming due. The financial hit was huge. Uber had to pay out a record-breaking $148 million to settle with all 50 U.S. states for hiding the breach. But it didn't stop there. Fines started rolling in from European authorities in the UK and the Netherlands, who, as you can imagine, were not thrilled about being kept in the dark for a year either. But the biggest consequence of all wasn't financial. It was personal. Joe Sullivan, the CSO, was criminally charged with obstruction of justice. His trial became this massive landmark case. And in the end, he was convicted, making him the first corporate executive ever to be held criminally responsible for covering up a data breach. The verdict sent a shockwave through Silicon Valley. The message was loud and clear. You can't just hide this stuff anymore. So after all that, the historic conviction, the massive fines, you'd think, okay, story's over, right? Uber learned its lesson? Well, the reality of cybersecurity today is just a lot messier than that, because the threats never stop evolving, and neither do the breaches. If you look at their history, you can see a clear pattern, but you can also see how the game is changing. Yeah, the first two big ones were because of sloppy security, leaving keys on a public GitHub page. But look at 2022. A hacker group basically just tricked an employee on Slack into giving them access. That's called social engineering. And then in 2023, the breach didn't even happen at Uber. It happened at a third-party law firm they used, and it exposed driver social security numbers. And that right there is the key takeaway for today's world. The fight has shifted. It's not just about building strong digital walls around your own servers anymore. Now it's about defending against clever psychological manipulation of your own people. It's about how secure every single partner you work with is. The number of ways a hacker can get in is just enormous, and they are always looking for that one weakest link. Which really brings us to this final thought. Look, Uber has said sorry, they've paid their fines, they insist they've changed. But this story is so much bigger than just one company. It's really about the fundamental trust we put in these apps we use every single day. And when that trust gets broken, not just by a hack, but by a deliberate, calculated choice to hide the truth, what does real accountability even look like? Is a simple sorry ever really enough?